Hey GC fam, it's so good to be back with you guys. I have just been extremely blessed by our conversations in Nehemiah so far. And it's only been 1 week, so I'm super excited to dive in and get deeper into this book. If you remember last week, we talked about how the book of Nehemiah is a book that centers around the idea of God's plan for restoration in his people. And we talked about how the gospel is like a multifaceted diamond. The message of Christ's life, death, and resurrection has many unique dimensions and context and abilities to it. And one of the things that it's unique about it is that it's actually a message of God's restoration to not just to our city of Amarillo, but also to the church. And right now, as we see the brokenness in our city with all the shootings on our side of town, when we see the brokenness within the church with all the fallings of big profile leaders and even the brokenness that we've experienced in the local church and throughout our lives, we need the gospel more than ever right now. We need the message of God's restoration more than ever. So as we continue on in chapter 2 today, what we're going to see is that now that Nehemiah has got on board with the idea of restoration, the idea of change, now we got to see what is the ignition that starts change. What's the ignition that starts restoration? And as we read through the book, as we read through this chapter, we're going to see that there's 4 components that need to come together in order for spiritual restoration to happen, not just in our city, but also in our churches. So let's talk about those 4 components. The first one is that we need to realize that we're going to face opposition. And we're going to see that in chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. Let's read those real quick. Starting in verse 9 of chapter 2. Then I came to the governors of the province beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent with me officers of the army and the horsemen. But when Sabat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel. So in these first couple of verses, we pick up where we left off in chapter 2 last week. You know, Nehemiah went before the king and he said, hey, I want to restore Jerusalem, restore my home city. The king said, yeah, do it. He gave him letters of authority and he said, hey, get the supplies you need. So Nehemiah goes to the governors of the surrounding regions and he says, hey, this is the project we're taking on. But we read in the verses that these governors weren't feeling it. They didn't like that. It displeased them greatly. And when we look at the historical context, we see that these governors were actually kind of like mob bosses who had been abusing the Jewish people in Jerusalem. They had been taking advantage of the poor and the oppressed there. And one thing we need to understand is that what these verses tell us is that as we engage in spiritual restoration, as we get on board with God's plan to restore people through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, we're going to face some spiritual opposition. We're going to face the spiritual forces of the kingdom of darkness and Satan against us because they do not want people to be restored. But look at what Nehemiah did that's so unique. He didn't come on his own authority or his own plan. He came showing the letters from the king. With the king's army and entourage, he came on the authority based upon the king. And one thing that tells us is that as we engage in restoration, as we expect opposition, we have to come on someone else's authority. We have to come in using someone else's authority, not ours. We have to come in on God's authority. And the best way we do that is through prayer. Prayer has this really unique ability to recalibrate our hearts and get us into the right state of mind, as we talked about last week. And so through prayer, we get to come in and understand that we are doing restoration based upon God's authority, not our own. We get the confidence of knowing that what we're doing is not our idea, but God's plan. And so my encouragement for you is pray for your city. Pray for Oakdale and pray for the East Side. Pray for our church. Be based upon God's authority, not your own. So that's the first step. The second thing that needs to happen in order for change to happen, the catalyst for change, is that we need to move forward in grace and not our own. We actually, and let me rephrase that. What we need to do is we need to see the brokenness that surrounds us. We need to not run from it, but we need to engage in it. And we read that in verses 11 through 15. So let me reread those for you real quick. So I went to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. Then I arose in the night, I and a few men with me, and I told no one what my God had put into my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me but the one on which I rode. I went out by night by the valley gate to the dragon spring and to the dung gate, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. Then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal that was under me to pass. Then I went up in the night by the valley and inspected the wall, and I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so returned. When we read these verses, what we see is that Nehemiah stayed up all night to inspect the brokenness of Jerusalem. And what's so unique about that is that he could have delegated it out to everybody, but he himself went out to just see the brokenness that was there. Why this is so unique and special is that Nehemiah had to understand the brokenness of his city in order to see what type of restoration needed to happen, where the healing needed to begin. And what this passage does is that it encourages us that if we want to see the type of healing that needs to happen in our city and in our churches, we need to engage with the brokenness. We don't need to avoid it or ignore it. We need to see what the brokenness is around us. In fact, let me put it this way. We need to see our own brokenness. We need to be introspective and see what brokenness lies there in order for us to see what type of healing that needs to happen. God challenges us to look at ourselves and see our own brokenness and see the brokenness around us, not to be a Debbie Downer or to make things worse, but in fact, to start the process of healing. You can't heal something that you don't know what's going on. So my encouragement for you is as we go through this book, be introspective. Ask God to show you what areas of your own life need to be healed from brokenness. What areas of our city need to be healed from brokenness. What areas of our church need to be healed from brokenness. And that's a big conviction for me, is that one reason why we need a church plant in this area is because I've talked to so many people who've been so pessimistic towards the church, have been so broken towards the church. And we want to be a church that listens and shows them that the gospel is healing. I encourage you, listen to people. Check yourself. Look at your own brokenness. That's the first step towards healing. Awesome. Okay, now, third component that needs to happen for change is going to be we need to look at things through God's grace. And I want to read verses 17 and 18 for you real quick. So verses 17 and 18 say this. Then I said to them, "You see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer suffer derision." And I told them of the hand of my God, and how he had been upon me for good, and also the words that the king had spoken to me. And they said, "Let us rise up and build." So they strengthened their hands for the good work. So in these verses, we see the story continue, and Nehemiah cast the vision to the people of Jerusalem. He said, hey, let's go build the wall. Let's go rebuild it. And here's the reasoning he gives. He says, for God's hands upon us. The king also supports us. You see, the vision that he cast for restoration is founded in the fact that God is with them. That he moved the hand of the king, that he was with them in their rebuilding. And that's what encouraged the people to engage in restoration. See, the reason why I want us to be engaging in restoration, not just in our city, but in the church, is not because we have the amazing plan, not because our church plan is going to be so special and better than any other church in this city, but because God is with us. Well, I want to encourage you to look into your own heart and see where it needs to be, where the brokenness is and where you need to be healed and restored. It's not because I have all the answers or because our GC is so amazing, but because God is so amazing. Healing and restoration is possible not because we're so great or so smart, but because God is doing the work. He's building his kingdom. What our job is in that amazing plan is to point people to the fact that he is building and restoring people through the life, death, and resurrection of his son, Jesus. And I hope that encourages you today. Let's look at the last component. And the last component that needs to happen is that we need to see our own place in God's restoration. Catalyst for change, the last thing that takes place is, what's our place in this mission? And when we go into the group on Wednesday, we're going to read chapter 3, verses 1 through 2. But I want to encourage you, when we read that, look at how everyone gets to work in rebuilding. And they all choose something specific that they can do, either rebuilding a gate or a portion of the wall. Here's the thing. You are not able to restore all the brokenness in the church by yourself. We can't fix Amarillo on our own. But God has uniquely placed us in unique places, either in our job, in our neighborhood, through this church plant, in order to bring some form of restoration to that aspect of the city or that portion of the church. Where is God calling you specifically? How's God calling our group or our church to specifically minister and restore portions of our city, portions of Christ's church that have been just broken through moral failings and abuse and things like that? I encourage you to pray about that and let's come to group and talk about it. I love you guys and can't wait to discuss this. God bless.